They lived through ice, through cold that lasted for thousands of years, and through a world where survival meant facing giant animals with nothing but sharpened wood in your hands. For nearly 300,000 years, one group of humans called Europe and parts of Asia their home. They were skilled hunters. They buried their loved ones with care. They wore feathers and ornaments as decoration, and they left marks on cave walls that still confuse scientists today. These were the Neanderthals, and for a long time we pictured them as slow, dumb, and brutish, dragging their knuckles through the snow. That picture was wrong, and modern research has proven it wrong again and again. But there is one part of their story that stayed hidden for even longer than the rest, a part that scientists only started to uncover seriously in the last few years. It is the story of Neanderthal women. Not the species as a whole, not the general idea of what a Neanderthal was, but the women specifically. What happened to them, how they actually lived day to day, and what their bones and their DNA are now quietly telling us is something that many researchers describe as deeply upsetting once you sit down and understand the full picture. This is not a story with monsters or great battles. It is quieter than that, and in some ways it is far more disturbing because of how ordinary and human it feels. By the time you reach the end of this video, you will look at the Neanderthals in a completely different way than you did 5 minutes ago. Let's get into it. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from today, and if you are new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. For decades, the experts who studied Neanderthals worked from a fairly simple assumption, one that most people never even thought to question. They assumed that Neanderthal society split along lines that felt familiar to us today. Men went out to hunt large animals while women stayed closer to camp, cared for children, prepared food, and gathered plants nearby. This idea felt natural to many researchers because it closely matched what they already believed about early human societies in general. It was a comfortable assumption, one that fit neatly into the story people already wanted to tell. It turned out to be a mistake, and a fairly significant one at that. Let's start by looking at what the skeletons themselves can tell us, because the physical proof on its own is honestly shocking once you break it down. Neanderthal women were not weak or delicate by any stretch of the imagination. Their skeletons show thick, dense bone structure and heavily developed points where muscles once attached to the bone, the kind of markers you would only expect to see from serious, repeated physical labor across an entire lifetime. When scientists compared the muscle attachment marks found on female Neanderthal bones to those found in people alive today, the results were remarkable. The closest match was not an average modern woman going about daily chores. The closest match came from elite male athletes, people who train their bodies at a competitive level for years. These women were built like professional competitors, their bodies physically shaped by constant, demanding, repeated physical activity, not by a quiet life spent close to a fire. Now think carefully about the injuries these women carried on their bones. When researchers studied the healed fractures found on female Neanderthal skeletons across multiple sites, a clear and consistent pattern kept showing up again and again. Most of the damage was concentrated around the skull, the neck, and the upper body, rather than scattered randomly across the entire skeleton. Scientists went looking for a group of modern people whose injury pattern matched this exact profile as closely as possible. They found one, and it might surprise you. Professional rodeo riders, people whose entire job revolves around getting dangerously close to large, wild, unpredictable animals, and who sometimes pay a physical price for it. This comparison tells us something important that bones alone rarely reveal so clearly. These injuries did not come from simple accidents, like tripping on rocks or slipping on ice during a walk. They came specifically from being in close physical contact with dangerous animals, and the exact same kind of animals that Neanderthal hunters chased down across open ground for food and survival. In other words, the women were not sitting safely back at camp while the men risked everything out in the wild. The women were right there in the middle of the hunt, taking the same risks, facing the same danger, and paying the same physical price for it, over and over again across their lives. This piece of evidence alone breaks apart the old, comfortable story we use to tell ourselves about Neanderthal daily life. But bones, no matter how detailed, can only tell us so much. They can show us what a body went through over a lifetime. What they cannot do is tell us how an entire Neanderthal community was actually organized, or where individual women originally came from, or how different groups spread out across the landscape actually connected to one another. For that level of detail, scientists needed something far more precise and far more revealing than bones alone could ever provide. They needed DNA. And once researchers finally got their hands on high-quality genetic material, the picture that slowly emerged was something nobody in the field had fully prepared themselves for. There is a cave hidden deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, tucked away in one of the coldest and most remote corners of the world. This single location has become one of the most important sites in the entire modern study of human origins. It is called Chagirskia Cave, and a discovery made there a few years ago completely reshaped what scientists thought they understood about how Neanderthals actually lived their day-to-day lives generation after generation. Digging at this cave site had already been going on quietly for years before the real breakthrough finally happened. What made this location so genuinely special was not just what researchers found buried in the sediment, but how much they found, and more importantly, when all of it appeared to have lived and died. Researchers eventually pulled the remains of at least 13 separate Neanderthal individuals from this single cave system. That number by itself was already unusual for a Neanderthal site. Most fossil locations give scientists scattered remains spread across wildly different time periods, sometimes separated from each other by many thousands of years, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct a single community. But the remains found at Chagirskaya were noticeably different from that pattern. Careful analysis suggested these 13 individuals had not simply built up over some long, uneven stretch of time. Instead, everything pointed toward them having lived within roughly the same narrow window, possibly even during the very same generation. For the very first time in the history of this field, researchers were not just staring at random, disconnected fragments scattered across the ages. They were looking at something that closely resembled an actual living, breathing community, a group of real individuals who might have known each other personally, hunted together side by side, and shared meals around the very same fire on cold winter nights. Scientists carefully extracted genetic material from several of these individuals, including a meaningful number of females among them. The preservation quality of the samples turned out to be excellent, and this detail matters enormously in this specific kind of research, because poorly preserved or contaminated samples can easily produce false or misleading results that send researchers down the wrong path entirely. Fortunately, the material recovered from Chagirskaya cave was clean and detailed enough to produce genuinely reliable genetic information from people who had lived roughly 54,000 years earlier, deep in the middle of the Ice Age. These results were eventually published in a major scientific study that appeared in the respected journal Nature back in 2022, assembled by a large international team of researchers working together across multiple countries. It was almost immediately recognized within the scientific community as one of the biggest and most important contributions to Neanderthal science in recent memory. But here's the real twist in this story. The true significance of the study was not simply in confirming things that scientists had already suspected for years. The real significance was hidden inside something buried deep within the genetic data, something that nobody had actually gone looking for in the first place, something that pointed directly and unmistakably toward the women of this ancient community. When the research team began carefully digging through the genetic results pulled from Chagirskaya cave, the first thing that jumped out at them was not one single dramatic discovery sitting right on the surface. Instead, it was an absence, a strange and genuinely troubling gap where something important should have clearly been present. That missing piece turned out to be genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is essentially the backbone of any population's long-term ability to survive and adapt over time. The wider the range of genetic variation that exists inside a group, the better that group can handle new diseases, adjust to changing environments, and recover after periods of hardship or loss. Even small, isolated groups of modern humans alive today typically hold onto a certain baseline level of genetic variety, largely thanks to thousands of years of movement, mixing, trade, and contact between different neighboring communities. This built-in variety is a major part of what has made our own species so remarkably resilient over such a long stretch of history. The Neanderthals living at Chagirskaya barely had any of this protective variety at all. When researchers sat down and calculated the estimated breeding population connected to this specific site, the number that came back was almost hard to believe at first glance. Their calculations pointed to somewhere between 10 and 20 individuals total. And to be completely clear here, this was not simply 10 to 20 people happening to live inside the cave at any single given moment in time. This figure represented the total effective breeding population actively contributing new genetic material to the group's gene pool across multiple generations. For a species fully capable of physically walking hundreds of kilometers across open, unforgiving terrain, a number this small points toward something dangerously close to extreme genetic isolation. To put this into some kind of useful perspective, some of the most remote and historically cut-off human populations that scientists have ever formally studied anywhere on Earth still show noticeably more genetic variation than what turned up at this single Siberian cave site. The Chagirskaya group was not simply small in size. It was sitting right at the very edge of what population science generally considers to be barely sustainable over the long run. This uncomfortable discovery immediately raised a difficult and unavoidable question that the researchers could not simply brush aside. How exactly was a group this genetically small managing to survive at all, generation after generation? Where was any fresh, new genetic material actually coming from? How were they somehow avoiding the slow, compounding damage that comes from repeated generations of close inbreeding within such a tiny group? The answer to all of this was quietly hiding inside the data all along, but actually finding it required researchers to separate the male and female genetic lines and study each one individually, rather than looking at the group's genetics as one single combined picture. That is exactly where things started to get genuinely unsettling. In the field of genetics, there are two specific tools that researchers regularly use to trace ancestry through a single parent line across many generations. Mitochondrial DNA passes down exclusively from mother to child, without fail, every single generation. The Y chromosome, on the other hand, passes down exclusively from father to son. By carefully examining these two separate lines side by side, scientists can reconstruct the maternal history and the paternal history of an entire population completely independently of one another, almost like reading two different books about the same family. At Chugurskaya, these two separate lines ended up telling two completely different stories. The Y chromosome results, tracing the male paternal line, showed exactly what most researchers would have expected to see from a tiny, isolated group like this one. Limited genetic variation, fully consistent with men who had lived their entire lives within the same small community, generation after generation, reproducing inside a narrow and largely closed gene pool that rarely changed. Fathers, sons, grandfathers, all staying firmly rooted in the very same place across long stretches of time, never straying far from where they were born. The mitochondrial results, however, told a completely opposite story. The maternal lines, passed down quietly through the women of the group, showed a level of genetic diversity that simply did not match up with the rest of the community's overall genetic pattern at all. The women in this small, isolated community were genetically different from one another in ways that the men clearly were not. This is not the pattern you would ever expect to see if these women had all grown up together from birth within the exact same group as the men around them. It is precisely the pattern you would expect to find if the women had originally come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere far outside this particular community. The conclusion that researchers ultimately reached from all of this was stark and hard to ignore. The women living within this Chugurskaya community had not been born there. They had not grown up inside this particular group at all. They had originated from other, completely separate communities, and had later been absorbed into this one at some point during their lives. In the specific language of population science, this exact pattern has a formal name. It is called female-biased dispersal. In much simpler terms, it basically means that the females were the ones who physically moved between different groups over time, while the males stayed rooted firmly in place for their entire lives. One particular case within the data stood out with striking, undeniable clarity. Researchers managed to identify a woman whose maternal genetic line could be traced back, not to Siberia at all, but instead to an entirely different population originating from the Caucasus region, located many thousands of kilometers away from where her remains were actually found. She had somehow ended up incredibly far from wherever her original ancestral line had first begun, generations earlier. The women, it seemed, had been moved, deliberately or otherwise. And once you really sit with that simple, quiet fact for a moment, it opens the door to something genuinely troubling about how Neanderthal society may have actually functioned underneath the surface, hidden beneath everything else we thought we already knew. Female-biased dispersal, as a pattern, is not something entirely unique to Neanderthals alone. We can observe this same general pattern in certain modern human societies today, and we also see very similar behavior among chimpanzees in the wild. In many different species across the animal kingdom, this particular pattern actually serves a clear and useful evolutionary purpose. It helps prevent damaging inbreeding within small, isolated groups by making sure that at least one side of the family, usually the female side in this case, consistently introduces fresh genetic material from outside sources. As a pure survival mechanism, this pattern makes complete biological sense when you break it down. It is almost elegant, in a strictly cold, scientific sense. But whether something ultimately feels elegant or feels disturbing depends heavily and entirely on the surrounding details and context. And the specific details uncovered in this particular case are exactly what make this finding so difficult and uncomfortable to simply sit with. In most animal species where this kind of female dispersal naturally happens, the physical distances involved tend to stay fairly small and manageable overall. A young female might move over to a neighboring group living just nearby, join that new community relatively easily, and continue living out her life in a world that still feels broadly familiar to her in most ways. The social disruption involved is certainly real and meaningful, but it generally remains bounded and limited in scope. That specific pattern does not appear to be what was actually happening with these particular Neanderthal women, based on everything the data seems to suggest. Remember here that the effective population size calculated at Chugurskaya was estimated only somewhere between 10 and 20 total individuals. That specific number tells us something absolutely crucial about the wider situation. Neighboring Neanderthal groups almost certainly could not have lived physically close together under these conditions. They simply could not have afforded to, given the circumstances. Too much overlap or close proximity between small groups constantly competing for the exact same scarce, limited resources across a brutal, unforgiving Ice Age landscape would have quickly become unsustainable for absolutely everyone involved on all sides. This strongly suggests that the physical distance between genuinely viable, separate Neanderthal communities scattered across the region was likely enormous, quite possibly stretching across hundreds of kilometers in many individual cases. The woman whose ancestry traces directly back to the Caucasus region is not simply some rare, isolated exception that researchers can easily explain away as unusual or unimportant. She clearly represents a much wider, consistent pattern found across the broader data. These women were not casually moving over to some nearby valley, just one town over from where they grew up. They were instead being fully absorbed into entirely new communities made up of complete strangers, placed into unfamiliar landscapes, and permanently separated from their original birth families, by distances that, in that particular era, would have felt essentially permanent and completely unreachable for the rest of their lives. There is genuinely no reliable way for DNA evidence alone to tell us whether this specific pattern of movement was something these women actively chose for themselves, or something that was instead forced upon them by circumstance or by others. Genetic data simply cannot answer a deeply human question like that one on its own. But what the genetic data absolutely can tell us, with real confidence, is that for Neanderthal women specifically, being displaced away from their birth community was clearly not some rare, occasional exception happening now and then. It appears instead to have been the standard, everyday structure underlying their entire social world. And that particular social world was about to collide head-on with a very different one, our own. We have already known for well over a decade now that modern humans living today still carry small traces of Neanderthal DNA inside their own genetic code. The full, complete mapping of the Neanderthal genome, first completed back in 2010, confirmed this reality beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. Roughly 2% of the total genetic code belonging to every single person alive today whose ancestry traces outside of Africa can actually be traced directly back to Neanderthal ancestors from tens of thousands of years ago. This remains, even now, one of the single most profound and genuinely surprising discoveries in the entire modern history of genetic science. Our species clearly did not simply wipe theirs out completely and then quietly move on with life. At some specific point, in some specific place, our two separate species actually came together and mixed, however briefly that contact may have actually lasted, and however limited it ultimately turned out to be in scope. But the specific way this particular genetic legacy ultimately played out over time tells us something quietly important about the nature of that contact. While modern humans today still carry small, scattered fragments of Neanderthal nuclear DNA spread throughout different parts of their genomes, the specific mitochondrial lines and the specific Y chromosome lines that originally belonged to Neanderthals disappeared completely and entirely from the human genetic record over time. Across tens of thousands of years, these particular genetic lines were gradually filtered out of existence altogether, leaving behind only scattered, fragmentary pieces of evidence from a species that had once thrived and hunted across an entire continent for hundreds of thousands of years. This pattern strongly tells us that the mixing between our two separate species was almost certainly not some simple, equal, balanced merger of two peoples meeting as true equals. It was instead something much closer to a slow, uneven, and largely one-directional genetic absorption happening gradually over an extended period of time. And yet, based on everything the evidence suggests, it seems highly likely that Neanderthal women specifically were the main primary point of connection and contact between our two very different species. They were already, within the internal structure of their own communities, the ones most accustomed and most used to being physically moved into completely unfamiliar groups of strangers. They were the ones who had spent their entire lives adapting, integrating, and quietly surviving among people they did not originally know, simply as a normal, everyday part of their existence and social structure. So, when modern humans eventually did arrive in territories that Neanderthals had already called home for literally hundreds of thousands of years before them, the women belonging to that older species were, based purely on the internal logic of their own long-established social structure, almost certainly the most likely group among them to end up in direct, sustained contact with these unfamiliar newcomers. What that specific contact actually looked like on a real, human, emotional level, we simply cannot say for certain based on DNA evidence alone. It might have been peaceful and gradual in nature. It might have involved a slow, steady blending of separate communities over multiple generations. Or it might have involved something considerably darker and more troubling than either of those possibilities. We honestly do not know for certain, and probably never fully will. What we do know with confidence, though, is the final outcome. Small, scattered fragments of their ancient genetic code went on to help carry humanity forward into the future, while their own species, tragically, did not manage to survive the journey itself. And remember, these specific groups were already sitting at dangerously low numbers, somewhere around 10 to 20 total individuals each. Losing even a small handful of women of reproductive age from a group that size, whether to outside groups entirely or through contact and absorption into modern human populations, was never simply a minor setback that could be easily absorbed. For a population already this fragile and this genetically isolated, it could very realistically mean the complete and total collapse of an entire family lineage, stretching back countless generations. Now take all of these separate pieces of evidence and put them together carefully, and one single, clear picture slowly begins to form in front of us. It is not the dramatic, sweeping version of history that popular imagination has generally favored for many generations now. The familiar story of modern humans violently sweeping across the entirety of Europe and brutally overwhelming a weaker, inferior species through open warfare and conflict. The real picture that emerges instead is considerably quieter than that dramatic version, and in many important ways, it is actually far harder to fully accept and process emotionally. Neanderthal extinction, based on everything the evidence suggests, was not a single dramatic event that happened all at once. It was instead a slow, gradual, steadily compounding process that had clearly already been quietly underway for a very long time before the last surviving Neanderthal populations finally vanished for good from the region around Gibraltar, roughly 40,000 years ago. And the underlying mathematics behind this slow, quiet collapse turn out to be almost brutally simple and straightforward once you actually break them down. Try to picture it clearly for a moment. Small, scattered groups of people, isolated from one another across a vast, endless, frozen landscape stretching in every direction. Women being steadily pushed outward, away from the families and communities they were originally born into, and placed instead into entirely new groups made up of complete strangers. Genetic diversity hovering constantly right at the very edge of what is biologically sustainable over the long term. And then, around 39,000 years ago, a massive, catastrophic volcanic eruption, known today as the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, struck without warning, representing the single largest volcanic event to hit the European continent in roughly 200,000 years. Volcanic ash spread rapidly across 3 entire continents in every direction. A harsh, sudden volcanic winter settled directly over the exact same regions where the last significant surviving Neanderthal populations happened to still be concentrated at that specific point in time. This massive eruption did not need to directly kill every single Neanderthal individual outright in order to cause total collapse across the species. It simply did not need to go that far. When an entire regional population is already made up of small, scattered groups containing only 10 to 20 individuals each, groups that were already genetically fragile and already steadily losing reproductive age, women through dispersal, and through ongoing contact with modern human groups, a sudden volcanic winter does not need to be an extinction-level catastrophe entirely on its own in order to finish the job. It only needs to gently nudge things slightly further in a direction they were already steadily heading toward regardless. Losing even a small handful of women from a group already that small in size was never something that population could realistically recover from over time. It was, in strict mathematical terms, essentially a quiet, slow-moving death sentence for that entire lineage. What makes this whole story genuinely so difficult and uncomfortable to sit with is not the violence of any single dramatic ending moment. There was no great sweeping battle to point to. There was no single catastrophic event we can clearly identify and say, this is precisely where it all ended for good. It is, instead, the quiet invisibility of the entire slow process that makes it feel so deeply unsettling once you really understand it. Just the steady, quiet arithmetic of too few people spread too far apart from one another, groups that had already become too genetically isolated to absorb any further meaningful loss without collapsing entirely. They did not fall in some dramatic, sweeping collapse. They simply quietly ran out of room to keep going any further. Try picturing them one final time. Small groups scattered widely across a freezing, unforgiving continent stretching in every direction. Women living far away from wherever they were originally born, folded quietly into communities made up entirely of people who remained strangers to them their whole lives, raising children of their own in a world that kept growing steadily colder, darker, and quieter with every single passing generation. None of these people had any real way of knowing that they were quietly living through the very final chapters of their entire species-long existence on this planet. Ancient DNA research has given us something truly extraordinary here, something researchers could barely have imagined accessing just a couple of decades ago. It has not simply handed us dry population estimates, scattered dispersal statistics, and cold, distant scientific numbers on a page somewhere. It has given us small, genuine glimpses into real individual human lives that once existed. A woman whose maternal ancestry traces all the way back to the distant Caucasus region, later found thousands of kilometers away, buried quietly inside a remote cave in Siberia. She was a real, living person who once breathed and walked and hunted. She herself, Or perhaps the women who came directly before her made that seemingly impossible journey across an unforgiving landscape, and she ultimately lived out the remainder of her life, and eventually died, surrounded by people who were never truly her own original people. That is not simply some abstract data point sitting quietly on a chart somewhere. That is a real life, a genuine human story, lived out fully by one real person who once existed. The wider legacy of the Neanderthals did not disappear completely from this world, even after their extinction. It survives on quietly inside every one of us alive today, quite literally woven directly into the genetic code of nearly every single person whose ancestry traces outside of Africa. A meaningful part of that surviving legacy was carried forward specifically by these displaced women, across distances that must have genuinely felt impossible to them at the time, through encounters and relationships and connections that we will probably never fully understand or fully piece together, no matter how advanced our science eventually becomes. What ancient DNA has quietly revealed to us about Neanderthal women is disturbing precisely because it feels so deeply and unmistakably human at its core. Being uprooted suddenly from home, living out an entire life in relative isolation among strangers, surviving right at the very outer edge of what any single person, or any entire people, can realistically endure over time. They genuinely deserved a far better telling of their own story than history originally chose to give them for so many generations. And now, slowly, quietly, piece by piece, modern science is finally beginning to give these long-forgotten women their story back, and their voice back, after tens of thousands of years of silence.